The first thing I heard was my mother's voice. "Pack your things and leave." I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the woman who had once told me that no matter what happened, this house would always be my home. For a few seconds, I honestly thought she was joking. Then my older brother Daniel stepped beside her and folded his arms. "She's serious," he said. I looked around the room, the old brown sofa where I had spent countless evenings, the family photographs hanging on the wall, the dining table where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and every little achievement. My entire childhood was inside those walls, and suddenly they were telling me I didn't belong there. "What did I do?" I asked quietly. My mother wouldn't look at me. Daniel did. "You've caused enough problems. Just go." "Problems," I repeated. "I've been paying the bills. I helped keep this house running. How can you say I don't belong here?" Daniel gave a cold laugh. "You really think that makes this your house?" Those words hurt more than being shouted at, because deep down, I had always believed this was my home. I looked at my mother one last time. "Mom?" She finally raised her eyes, and what I saw in them broke something inside me. There was no regret, no hesitation, just silence. I went upstairs and packed a small suitcase. I didn't take the family photographs. I didn't take the furniture. I didn't even take the things that had sentimental value. I took only what I could carry. When I walked toward the front door, Daniel opened it for me. "Don't come back," he said. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me. I stood on the driveway with one suitcase in my hand and tears burning my eyes. That night, I had nowhere to go. But what they didn't know was that their decision would change everything. They thought they had thrown me out of my home. They thought I had lost. They were wrong, because years later, the same people who told me I didn't belong in that house would stand on that exact same driveway and discover that I was the one who owned it. Before that night, I had never imagined that my own family could make me feel like a stranger. To me, that house wasn't just a building. It was every birthday candle I had blown out in the kitchen, every Christmas morning when we gathered around the old dining table, every rainy afternoon when my father and I sat by the window drinking tea and talking about life. My father had bought the house when I was 12. He used to say, "A house becomes a home because of the people inside it." I believed him. After he passed away, I promised myself I would take care of Mom and keep the family together. For years, I did exactly that. I worked long hours and contributed whatever I could. When the roof needed repairs, I paid my share. When the kitchen needed renovation, I helped. When Mom's expenses increased, I never complained. I wasn't looking for praise. I simply thought that was what family did. Daniel, however, saw things differently. He was my older brother, and after Dad died, he slowly began acting like he was the head of the family. At first, it was small things. He started making decisions without asking me. Then he began telling Mom that I was irresponsible. "You're too trusting," he would tell her whenever I wasn't around. "I worry about what will happen to this house." I ignored him. I thought time would prove that his suspicions were unnecessary. Instead, Daniel became more controlling. One evening, I came home from work and found him sitting with Mom at the dining table. There were several papers in front of them. "What are those?" I asked. Daniel quickly gathered them. "Nothing you need to worry about." That answer immediately made me suspicious. Why wouldn't I need to worry? Mom looked uncomfortable. Daniel smiled. "Because you're not the one making decisions anymore." I laughed nervously, thinking he was trying to provoke me, but he wasn't joking. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. Mom stopped discussing household expenses with me. Daniel began telling relatives that I was difficult and selfish. Even some family members started treating me differently. I couldn't understand why. Then one afternoon, I overheard Daniel talking to Mom. "She thinks she's entitled to this place," he said. Mom replied quietly, "She has done a lot for us, and that's exactly why she thinks she owns it." I stood outside the room, completely stunned. I didn't own the house. I had never claimed that I did. I simply believed I was part of the family that lived there. But Daniel had already turned my kindness into something he could use against me. A few days later, he confronted me. "You need to start thinking about moving out." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because Mom wants peace." I looked toward the kitchen where Mom was standing silently. "Mom, is that true?" She didn't answer. That silence told me everything. For the first time, I realized the house I had spent years protecting might never have been mine in the way I thought. Still, I never imagined they would actually throw me out. That came later, and when it did, I finally understood something my father had once tried to teach me. Sometimes, the place you call home isn't where you belong. Sometimes, losing it is the first step toward finding where you truly do. 3 days later, I came home earlier than usual. I remember it because the house was unusually quiet. There were no sounds from the television, no dishes clattering in the kitchen, no music coming from Daniel's room. I opened the front door and immediately noticed something strange. 2 suitcases were sitting beside the stairs. I stopped. "What's going on?" Daniel walked out of the dining room. He wasn't alone. Mom was behind him, and beside her stood a man I had never seen before. The man was holding a folder. Daniel looked at me and said, "Sit down." I didn't. "Who is he?" The stranger introduced himself as a lawyer. My stomach tightened. "A lawyer? Why?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Mom. Then he placed several papers on the table. "We've decided that you need to leave." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Leave where?" "Anywhere you want." I looked at Mom. "Mom, what's happening?" She looked down at her hands. Daniel answered for her. "You've been staying here long enough. It's time for you to move on." I stared at the papers. There were documents concerning the house. My name wasn't anywhere on them, but neither was Daniel's. "Why are you showing me these?" "Because Mom is the legal owner," Daniel said, "and she has decided that you can't stay here anymore." My heart dropped. I had known the house wasn't officially mine, but I had never imagined that my own mother would use that fact against me. "After everything I've done for this family," Daniel shook his head. "Here we go again." I turned toward Mom. I paid for repairs. I covered expenses when Dad died. I stayed when everyone else wanted to leave. "I never asked you for anything." She finally looked at me. "I know." "Then why?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she still didn't defend me. Daniel stepped closer. "Because this house belongs to Mom, not you." Something inside me went completely quiet. All those years I had believed we were protecting the same home. Apparently, I had been the only one who thought that. I looked at the lawyer. "Do I really have to leave today?" He hesitated. "You've been given notice." Daniel pointed toward the stairs. "Your things are already packed." I looked upstairs. My bedroom door was open. My belongings had been thrown into boxes. Someone had gone through my personal things without asking. That hurt more than anything else. I walked upstairs slowly. Inside my room, I saw an old photograph of Dad lying on the floor. I picked it up and wiped the dust from the frame. For a moment, I remembered his voice. "Take care of your mother. Take care of your family." I had spent years keeping that promise. And now my family was the one breaking me. I packed what little remained. When I came downstairs, Daniel was waiting by the door. "You'll be better off somewhere else," he said. I looked directly at him. "Maybe you're right." He smiled, thinking he had won. I picked up my suitcase. But before I walked out, I turned to Mom. "I hope one day you remember who I was before you believed everything he told you." She said nothing. I stepped outside. The door slammed behind me. I stood there for a long moment. Then I wiped my tears and walked away. I had lost my home. But that night, I made myself a promise. I would never beg them to let me back in. One day I would build something of my own. And when that day came, they would remember the person they threw away. For the first few nights, I barely slept. I rented a tiny room above a small grocery store across town. It wasn't much. The ceiling had a crack running across it, the heater made strange noises, and the window didn't close properly, but it was mine. No one could tell me to leave. No one could threaten to take it away. Still, every night, I found myself thinking about the old house. I remembered Dad sitting at the kitchen table, Mom laughing during family dinners, Daniel and I arguing over who got the last piece of cake. Those memories hurt, but I refused to let them destroy me. The next morning, I went to work. Then I worked the next day, and the day after that, I stopped calling home. I stopped explaining myself to relatives. When people asked what had happened, I simply said, I needed a fresh start. I didn't tell them everything because I had learned something important. You can't convince people to value you when they've already decided not to. So I focused on myself. I took extra hours at work. I started saving every dollar I could. I learned new skills at night, even when I was exhausted. Some days were incredibly difficult. There were mornings when I woke up and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake by walking away. Then I would remember Daniel standing at the door. Don't come back. Those words became fuel. Months passed. My small savings account slowly grew. Then, unexpectedly, my manager offered me a better position. It came with more responsibility and a much better salary. For the first time since leaving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I moved into a slightly bigger apartment. I bought a second-hand desk. I decorated the walls with simple photographs. It wasn't the home I had grown up in, but every piece of it represented something I had earned myself. Then, almost 2 years after I had been thrown out, something happened that changed everything. I received a phone call from an old family acquaintance. His voice sounded hesitant. I heard you're doing well. I am, I replied. There was a pause, then he said, You probably don't know this, but your mother's house is in trouble. I sat up. What do you mean? Your brother made some financial decisions. Things didn't work out. They may have to sell the house. I stared at the wall, the house. The same house they had used to prove that I didn't belong. The same house I had walked away from with one suitcase. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Then he mentioned something else. The house is being sold below market value. I didn't answer immediately. That night, I barely slept, not because I wanted revenge, because an idea had entered my mind, an idea that seemed impossible. I opened my savings account and looked at the number. For the first time, I wondered, what if I could buy it? Not to hurt them, not to prove anything, but because maybe it was time to take back the place where my story had been broken. The next morning, I made one phone call, and that call would change everything. The next morning, I called the real estate agent whose number I had received. My hands were shaking slightly when I asked, Is the house on Maple Street actually for sale? There was a pause. Yes. Are you interested? I am. The agent asked me several questions about my finances, and I answered honestly. I had saved carefully for 2 years. My new position had given me a stable income, and I had managed my money better than I ever had before. Still, buying that house would be the biggest decision of my life. Would you like to see it? The agent asked. I almost said no. Then I remembered the last time I had stood on that driveway with a suitcase in my hand. Yes, I said, I want to see it. That afternoon I drove past the house. I didn't go inside. I simply parked across the street and stared at it. The windows looked the same. The old tree Dad had planted in the front yard was still there. Even the porch light was the same. For a moment, I felt 12 years old again. Then I reminded myself that I wasn't that person anymore. I was the person who had survived being thrown out. The following day, I toured the house with the agent. Walking through the front door felt strange. The living room was almost empty. The dining table was gone. Several walls had been repainted, but the staircase was still there. I stood at the bottom and remembered carrying my suitcase down those steps. The agent noticed my expression. Have you been here before? I looked at her. Yes, she didn't ask anything else. I walked into the kitchen. That was where Dad used to make tea. I touched the old countertop and felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. The house wasn't perfect. It needed repairs. But I knew every corner. I also knew exactly what it meant to me. That evening, I made my decision. I want to make an offer. The agent looked surprised. Are you sure? I nodded. I've never been more sure about anything. The offer was accepted after several tense days of negotiation. Then came the paperwork. I read every document carefully. I checked every detail. I didn't want anything to go wrong. When I finally signed the final papers, I sat there for a moment, staring at my signature. The house was legally mine. I had imagined that moment many times. I thought I would feel powerful. Instead, I felt strangely peaceful. I had spent years thinking I needed my family's approval to feel like I belonged. I finally understood that I didn't. But there was one problem. My mother and Daniel were still living there. The sale agreement gave them time to move out. They had no idea who the new owner was. The agent had kept my identity private, just as I requested. For the first time, I had a choice. I could call them. I could tell them immediately, or I could wait. I chose to wait, not because I wanted to humiliate them. I simply wanted them to experience what I had experienced once. Uncertainty. The following week, I received a message from the agent. The closing is complete. You officially own the property. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I drove to the house. I parked in front of the same driveway where Daniel had once told me never to come back. I took the new keys from my pocket. They looked ordinary, but to me they represented something much bigger. I walked toward the front door. Before I could knock, it opened. Daniel stood there. He looked at me and froze. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his expression changed. You? I held up the keys. Yes. He stared at them. What are you doing here? I looked past him at the house where I had grown up. Then I calmly answered, I think you already know. His face went pale. For the first time, Daniel realized that the person he had thrown out years ago had just become the owner of the home he thought he controlled. Daniel stared at the keys in my hand as if they were something impossible. You can't be serious. I didn't answer. Behind him, Mom appeared in the hallway. What is it? She asked. Then she saw me. Her face immediately changed. For a moment, she simply stood there. I could see the memories passing through her eyes. The night she watched me leave, the suitcase in my hand, the door closing behind me. Why are you here? She whispered. I looked at her. I came home. Daniel stepped forward. This isn't funny, I know. You don't live here anymore. I calmly held up the documents the agent had given me. Actually, I do. Daniel grabbed the papers from my hand and began reading. His expression changed with every line. No. He looked at me. No, this can't be right. Mom took the papers from him. She read the first page, then the second. Her hands began to tremble. The house was no longer hers. The ownership had officially transferred to me. Daniel looked at me with disbelief. You bought this house? Yes. With what money? The money I earned after you threw me out. He went silent. I didn't say it to hurt him. I simply wanted him to understand something. The person he had considered worthless had built a life without him. Mom slowly sat down. I didn't know, she whispered. I know. I didn't know you could afford it. I couldn't when I left. She looked up at me. Then how? I smiled faintly. I worked. There was a long silence. Daniel started pacing. This isn't fair. I almost laughed. Fair? He stopped. You threw me out of this house. That was different. How? He had no answer. Mom looked at me with tears in her eyes. Can we talk? I nodded. We sat in the living room, the same room where everything had changed years earlier. Mom looked around. I made a mistake. I didn't respond. I should never have let Daniel convince me that you were trying to take this house from us. I looked at her. I never wanted the house back then. She lowered her eyes. I know that now. Daniel remained standing. You're really going to make us leave? I looked at him. I haven't decided. His expression softened immediately. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, but I wasn't interested in making a decision out of anger. I had spent too many years carrying that anger, so I stood. "I'll give you time to find somewhere else." Mom looked shocked. "You're not throwing us out tonight?" "No," she began crying. Daniel looked confused. I continued, "You once told me to leave because this wasn't my home." I placed the keys on the table. "Now it is." Neither of them spoke. I walked toward the front door. Before leaving, I turned around. "I didn't buy this house to punish you." I paused. "I bought it because I finally realized I didn't need anyone's permission to belong somewhere." Then I stepped outside. For the first time, the house behind me didn't feel like a place I had lost. It felt like a chapter I had finally closed. And the strange thing was, I wasn't celebrating their defeat. I was celebrating my own freedom. For the first time in years, I had the power to hurt them back. I could have changed the locks that same night. I could have thrown their belongings onto the driveway and told them to experience the same pain I had felt. Part of me wanted to, but then I remembered standing outside that house with one suitcase in my hand. I remembered how small and helpless I had felt, and I realized something. If I did the same thing to them, I wouldn't be free. I would simply become another version of the people who had hurt me. So I gave Mom and Daniel 30 days to find another place. Daniel was angry. "You're enjoying this," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm choosing not to become you." That silenced him. Mom spent most of those weeks apologizing. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she tried to explain why she had listened to Daniel. I listened, but I didn't pretend everything could return to normal. An apology can open a door. It doesn't erase what happened. When the 30 days were over, Mom packed her final box. Before leaving, she stood in the doorway and looked around. "This was your father's favorite room," she said quietly. "I know." She looked at me. "I wish I had remembered that before I let you leave." I didn't know what to say, so I simply hugged her. It wasn't forgiveness for everything. It was me letting go of the anger. Daniel was the last to leave. He carried his suitcase to the car, then turned back. "You really won," he said. I shook my head. "No, Daniel. That's not what this was about." He looked confused. "I didn't win because I bought the house." I pointed toward the front door. "I won the day I stopped needing your approval." He stared at me for a moment, then walked away. After they left, I stood alone in the living room. The house was completely silent. For years, I had thought getting this house back would make me happy. But standing there, I finally understood. It wasn't the house I had wanted. It was the feeling of belonging. And I had finally found that within myself. I opened the windows and let fresh air fill the rooms. Then I took down the old family photographs. Not because I hated the past, because I was ready to make new memories. That night, I sat at the same dining table where our family had once eaten together. But this time, I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to stay. I was home not because they had finally accepted me, because I had finally accepted myself. A few months after Mom and Daniel left, the house felt different, not empty, peaceful. I painted the walls, repaired the old kitchen, and planted flowers in the backyard where Dad used to sit on summer evenings. Slowly, I stopped seeing the house as the place where I had been betrayed. It became the place where I had started again. Mom and I eventually began speaking occasionally. Things were never exactly the same, and I knew they never would be. But I no longer needed them to be. Daniel disappeared from my life for a while. Then one afternoon, he sent me a short message. I was wrong. I stared at those 3 words for a long time. I could have ignored them. Instead, I replied, "I hope you become a better person because of it." Then I put my phone down. That was enough. Looking back, I realized they thought throwing me out would destroy me. They thought I would come crawling back. They were wrong. Losing that house forced me to discover something I had forgotten. A home isn't defined by walls, furniture, or a family name. It's defined by the place where you feel safe being yourself. And sometimes, The people who push you away accidentally give you the freedom to become who you were meant to be. They kicked me out believing they had taken everything from me. But they had only taken away the place I thought I needed. In return, I built a life they could never take away. And in the end, it was never about the house. It was about realizing that I had never needed their permission to belong.